to Sid to introduce Scott for our program today for the 2021 League virtual luncheon again. Thank you. And if everybody could mute their mics while Scott is speaking, that'll be probably helpful. Thank you.
And I think we should say that our president, Lena Pena, is under the weather today, so can't be joining us. She said it's
interrupt with questions, or should we save them till the end?
Which way do you want questions, Scott? During or after?
Either is fine. Of course, please interrupt me. But my plan is to talk relatively briefly, so we have a big, generous time for Q&A. So either is fine, but I promise to the best of my ability not to drone on and on and on, so we have lots of time for conversation.
Good. I see Priscilla is on, which means Sonia must be on too, so that's good. We're picking up people. Okay, I'm Sydney Walter. I'm the vice president of the Laramie League, actually. So Dr. Scott Henkel is the director for the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research, which is a new entity on campus. He's the Wyoming Excellence Chair in the Humanities and associate professor in the departments of, you're going to love this, English and African American and Diaspora Studies on campus. He's the author of Direct Democracy, Collective Power, The Swarm and the Literatures of the Americas, which won a CLR James Award for Best Published Book for Academic or General Audiences from the Working Class Studies Association in 2018. I have not seen this book. He is a 2019 graduate of Leadership Wyoming. He's also the lead for the Democracy Laboratory, a project of the Humanities Research Institute that's devoted to one of the most difficult problems we face, and that is how to make liberty and justice for all a fact of life rather than a distant dream. You all are going to be receiving a copy of this book that is a reader put out by the Humanities Council. I haven't completed reading it, but it's a lot of fun to read. Different essays written by people whose names you will recognize and a few maybe that you won't. Anyway, he's gone back and found some people pertinent in Wyoming history and in American democracy. And you will enjoy reading this book. So we'll mail some and we'll deliver some of these, so you'll be receiving this fairly soon. So Scott and I, okay. If you have one of these, you can let me know. Send me a note, will you? And then I'll take you off my list. Anyway, Scott and I met for a couple of hours to plan the talk today. And I think we stayed on topic quite a bit of the time. Mm-hmm. We had a great time talking about the league. And anyway, I'm sorry that we can't be in person with him, but we'll get him to a league function sometime soon. So Scott, it's all yours. I'm going to mute.
Thank you for that, Sid. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, everyone. I am deeply grateful for the opportunity to talk with you today. As I said a moment ago, my hope is to talk for a relatively short period and use the vast majority of the time that we have together for questions and conversation. But let me just say first, thank you once again. I deeply appreciate, I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk with you. You know, I would love to be able to say something so trite as the work of the league is deeply important. It's always deeply important. But as Katie and I were chatting a little bit before this, we don't even live in normal times. We live in precarious, difficult times. So I need not preach to the choir. I won't tell you what you know already. Most of you know it in a way that's deeper and more meaningful than I do. But, you know, I hope you reach deep and you give to the league in whatever ways you can. And I will join you in that. So thank you for it. Indeed, a brand new democracy laboratory at the University of Wyoming. I'll chat with you a little bit about what that is. But I think instead of like saying what it is and then why it needs to exist, I'm going to reverse that and talk maybe about some of the reasons and a little bit of the backstory and some of the ideas that got us all thinking on this road. It wasn't January 6th that, we went live. We launched the thing after January 6th, but the thing has been in motion for a good couple of years now. Those of you who pay attention to the world in which we live and politics in that world, January 6th didn't come out of nowhere. We had a long build up to it. So we've been thinking about these things for quite some time. One of my models, my dear friends, Jenny Kraft and Amy Albright, up in Sheridan at the Sheridan College Center for a Vital Community. I've been thinking about what spreading the idea of their CVC, Center for a Vital Community, to other communities in Wyoming might look like. And the Democracy Lab is we are super happy to be partners with Amy and Jenny and to have them help design what we might do, what we might look for out of the Democracy Lab. And one of the things that they care about deeply, which I also care about deeply, they see lesser participation in their communities for all sorts of reasons. And of course, one of the big reasons is that things are quite toxic these days. And toxic conversations where the angriest among us, where the lesser angels of our nature, if you will, are the ones who seem to take up all of the oxygen. One of the things that Jenny and Amy noticed was they were having a harder time getting people involved with their initiatives, harder time getting people to volunteer to serve on boards or to run for election. So one of the ideas is, the better angels of our nature, they don't defend ourselves. Ideas don't defend themselves. Good intentions don't defend themselves. They need people to defend them. They need organization. They need cooperation, which again, I need not talk to you because you know of that oh so well because of the work that you do. That's sort of the idea, right? To organize people around thinking about what the quality of democracy is, what it could be, where we're headed. Super hard questions like how to remain embedded members of our communities who like roll up our sleeves and get to work in the here and now. And also to take a bigger look at trends and where we might be going and ask some big questions. So anyway, the Democracy Lab is part of that bigger ecosystem in the state of Wyoming that works on civic issues, that try to give people some training and some support when they engage their communities. And it's a difficult thing, and maybe one of the things that we can talk about in the Q&A, but indeed people are anxious and scared about an uncertain future at the moment. And I think it's important maybe not to give into the loudness and the anger, but also maybe to recognize the conditions that motivate it and try to speak to it and try to remember that there are people who, instead of alleviating that anxiety and that fear, would try to manipulate that anxiety and that fear. So to build some resources around supporting people as they engage in our communities, that's sort of the gist. I have enjoyed very much, let me see if I can get the glare off it. I have very much enjoyed working my way through this. And in the things that I'm going to say shortly, you'll sort of see. An idea, I'm going to give all the information away right here at the start. An idea for me that is like a North Star guiding my work and my research, and also the work of the Democracy Lab. Most people think of democracy as a form of government, and of course it is. The etymological root from the Greek of democracy, demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power, rule, or authority. The idea that democracy isn't something like out there, distant from us, but rather that people have power. That's the root, that's the etymology of the word. The North Star for me, people have power. We can multiply that power by working together. These are profoundly ethical questions, because power can be exercised in ways that serve the good. Power can be exercised in ways that serve the bad. And here it is. I mean, I didn't even have to look beyond page 3 of your book. General guidelines. The goal is to work collaboratively, in partnership, working together to influence public policy. All right there. Good ideas in a vacuum held by one person, they're weaker than when people cooperate. It's difficult how to. What makes a good group? What makes a well-functioning, high-functioning group that can see its wishes take place? These are hard questions, but working together is sort of how we get there. And I looked for like one single example through the book, but the other part of that North Star idea for me is that this power is not just in a select group of people. It is not just in the talented. It is not just in people with particular gifts, but this democratic power is in every single one of us. I can think of no better justification for many of the League's policies about access, about the right to know, about the right to choose, about all sorts of things that go all the way down the line when we begin with the premise that this democratic power is in every single human being. What that is, what that looks like, these are super hard, super thorny questions. In fact, the Democracy Lab, I'll get into now like sort of the nitty gritty of what it is and what it might be. Part of it was born in the University of Wyoming's Grand Challenge Initiative. The Grand Challenge Initiative is an attempt to muster some resources around some of the biggest and hardest and thorniest challenges that we face. President Saito, who I know a number of you know in various capacities, is fond of saying that if a grand challenge can be solved in 10 years, then it's too small. So, liberty and justice for all. What would it look like to make that a practical reality? What could democracy be? In a moment, I'll talk also about the Democracy Lab's launch event, which we had, and thank you several of you to coming for it. Our author, Danielle Allen, is fond of quoting Ralph Ellison about becoming our idea of what a free people could be. What that looks like, how to accomplish it. These aren't things that are going to be solved next week or next month or next year. These are things that take dedicated time and effort and labor, even to think about, let alone to bring into being. So anyway, the Democracy Lab, we're a team of about a dozen people, mostly based at the University of Wyoming, but also public servants from around the state, students, faculty, and staff, of course. And the hope is to organize some resources around these big questions. Our launch event was on October 5th with Danielle Allen. And when I'm done talking, I'll put the information for any of you who would like to see it. If you missed it, I'll put the information about it into the chat so you can check it out. But this year, the Democracy Lab team is going to spend our time thinking about what its core programs are going to look like, what a curriculum for the lab is going to look like, how people engage. The core program will be a year-long cohort experience that mixes faculty, senior and junior, together with graduate students and undergraduates and members of the public in order to work on questions along these lines, in order to produce some research, to enhance faculty teaching, to enhance students' experiences. And as I began, Jenny and Amy up in Sheridan, the question of how to get people to participate, maybe not just a question of reducing barriers to participation. Of course, that's important, but people need tools and infrastructure and support in order to engage with their communities. And this is one of the things that I hope the Democracy Lab can do. After so many years of people going through the cohort experience, to build up a good mass of people who are engaged, who have some skills, who have some resources to work in our communities in ways that they see fit. So, very broad overview, but that is where I'm going to stop. I am happy to have a conversation with you. If you have questions, I'm happy to go into further detail about any of this. I'm going to type a few things into the chat also, resources that please check them out as you wish. But once again, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm so happy to be with you, and I look forward to a nice conversation. Here's a couple of things. If you would like to see what our launch event was, here's the recording of it. Okay. Here also, we take great inspiration from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, of which Danielle Allen was one of the leads. And then lastly, from the same group, here is the report. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, this is a big mouthful, put together this document called Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century. And here is their report. As I was going through this document, I was, not surprised, but of course, it's always useful to see the many, many overlapping ideas between that document and this one. So thank you very much. Some information for your Sunday reading, should you wish. Katie, hit her hand up, please.
So I'm gathering from what you said, you see this as kind of a long-term type effort. I think some of the challenges that we face are going to be facing us in the short term. What is the Democracy Lab looking at in the short term, or is this all long-term engagement? And how are you going to recruit people to be involved, or what kind of training? That's a lot of questions. So let me stop there.
But those are good and excellent questions. In fact, let me answer it in that way. There are a number of foundational guiding questions that I want the Democracy Lab to ask. How at one and the same time to be involved in our communities and to be able to react to things that are going on right now, and also to take a bigger, deeper view of things. I imagine many of you would know some of the names of people involved in the Democracy Lab. I imagine many of you know Sarah Flittner of Jackson. I imagine many of you know Sean Reese, formerly of Cheyenne, who worked for Governor Meade, who is now the Wyoming Humanities Council's executive director. I haven't lived in Wyoming for very long, but the most recent event for the League of Women Voters that I attended was a candidate forum last year, because I was one of the team members on the Wallish for Wyoming campaign for Senate District 6 over there in Cheyenne. Margaret and Joan, hello, over to you. So many of us, these are just never fully answerable questions. How to act in the world in the here and now, which is vitally important. And also not to get caught up just in the here and now, but to think about bigger questions and longer trends. So yeah, we are a public institution and believe in the values of public service. So we'll have to think, as many of you no doubt think. You have a hat on for a little while of doing a certain thing that may be over here. You have a hat on over here that does a certain thing. These are just constant questions that we're always going to be asking. How intensely, I mean, among these other questions, how intensely to be focused on, say, for example, the Laramie community, or Southeast Wyoming, or Wyoming, or nationally or internationally. I hope that, one of the things that Democracy Lab does is keep these questions open so we can work on all of them. I see Jamie's hand and then Matthew's hand too. I didn't see which one.
I was in, Scott, I was in Greece in 2019 where democracy supposedly began. And I was speaking with some people, just street vendors, who said, we don't have a democracy anymore. And how do you think that democracy could have slipped away in Greece? And could it happen here?
Yeah.
Would it be the same?
Could it happen here? Of course it could happen here. It could happen anywhere. There's nothing like in the soil. There's nothing in people's DNA to make a country or a person democratic, like naturally or biologically. These are all political choices that we make, and not make once, but make over and over and over again in our commitments to what we want to be as a country, what we want to be as a community. Yet, I meant to imply, and I'm glad that you picked up on, like, there are deep and profound challenges that we have right now. People are, in fact, anxious and scared about an uncertain future because of many reasons. Yeah. Because poverty is a grand challenge that we seem not to be able to solve. And sexism and racism and all of these things agitate people in such a way that make them fearful. This is a complex problem with many moving parts. But when people can be made to be afraid, they can also be made to follow people who might not have their interests at heart and would want to manipulate that fear. This is part of my work. My work as a researcher is to study the relationship between democracy, labor, and slavery in the Americas, by which I mean the Caribbean and Latin America. And there is, in fact, differences from place to place and time to time, but there are also trends to look out for and watch for. And one of those things to watch for is people manipulating others' fears for their own gain. When you see people manipulating others' fears for their own gain, it's often a sign that democracy is in danger. Do we see that around us? Of course we do. Should we guard for it? Of course we should. I see Joan's hand. Oh, I saw Matthew's hand first, and then Joan. Sorry, Matthew.
Yeah, so I posed a similar question that I'm about to ask to your opening event, and when I did it there, it got kind of mangled and distorted, and I didn't really get a good answer on it. But now nobody can stop me today, so here we go. This question is great for you because you just wrote a book about this. So, and maybe it'll even segue into some kind of discussion. So are you familiar with Aristotle's writings on democracy?
Indeed, I am.
Yeah, so
I'm a little rusty though, so you should maybe remind me.
Yeah, so specifically what I want to get at is in Aristotle's Politics series, so Aristotle was kind of like a critic or even an opponent of democracy, but one thing we can glean from his writings is what the Athenian system was. And specifically, in Aristotle, you will learn that the Athenians considered elections to be a fundamentally oligarchic institution because they always select for a particular strata of society with the money, the resources, the time to run for office. And this happens even before a vote is cast. You might observe this today in the Wyoming legislature, but just the composition is almost entirely landowners, business owners, attorneys, etc. So that's what the Athenians thought about elections. Instead, one of the three key features of democracy, according to the Athenians, according to Aristotle, was instead selecting public officials through random lot. So today we call it sortition, and the last remaining institution of this is jury duty. That descends directly from the Athenian system. And so what my question, and it's kind of a rhetorical question, could it be that the intense dissatisfaction with representative government that we see today in part derives from an unarticulated realization that it actually isn't so democratic?
Yeah. First, a comment on Danielle Allen's answer to your question, and then my answer to your question. Danielle Allen picked up, you mentioned quickly, if my memory serves, the idea of adding another legislative body.
Yeah, that might be a potential a direction I'm going with this.
Yeah. And that's what she picked up on. And that's what, if my memory serves, that's what she dwelled to the greatest length on. She talked about that part of your answer to a great part. And her answer was something like, we're not beyond repair at the moment. Yeah, Gotham is not beyond saving at the moment. So rather than adding another branch to the legislative body, indeed, thank you, Sid, for holding up Danielle Allen's book. She didn't like it. She talked more quickly though, she talked more quickly, and maybe I'll talk at a little bit more length about some of the other ideas. Sortition, super fascinating. I mean, let's talk logically for a second. If indeed democracy is for all, that there's a democratic power in every single one of us, what would be the structure that best expresses that? It might be something like sortition, where average citizens on the random are selected for various tasks. Jury duty, as you correctly point out, is the one example in practice that we have about it. And I'll just say my experience with jury duty. Most people go into jury duty, and I was one of these. I got called for jury duty, and I said, "Oh my God, I'm so busy. I have so many things to do. My teaching load is so heavy. I have papers to grade. What is all of this, right?" And then I went into it, and unfortunately, my pool was dismissed before I got to go through a whole case. But what I came out of, even in a brief fulfillment of my obligations as a juror, is a pretty profound sense of, oh my gosh, now I see the reason for why this works. Now I see the logic behind it, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but the people who organized my stint as a juror said, this is nearly everyone's experience. They come in lamenting that they have to take time out of it, and then they go through it and they see the value in it. I don't know whether that's true or not, but if the logic is democracy isn't a game for the few, but rather a game for all of us, we would probably have more examples of that kind of structure in our system. What do you think about that, Matthew?
Wait, so are you saying the reason we don't see all this stuff is because I'm not following your argument.
Yeah. No. I'm saying that for my experience, at least, the thing that we have in our system at the moment that looks closest to sortition is jury duty. And my experience of it, at least, was a positive one. I wonder if that were expanded, whether other people would find positive experiences in it too. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I absolutely agree. In fact, the Athenians did it for like 150 years, 150, 200 years. They had a random lot-based system of government, and they really liked it. And in fact, it was overthrown multiple times in that history, and then they went right back and overthrew the coup. and brought back their system because they liked it so much. So yeah, and a lot of times people say that, oh, that can't be done with like modern populations. We have too many people now in our governments, and I just point to jury duty and I say, hey, it works there. Works there.
You don't actually know it works. We don't have an objective assessment of whether verdicts were correct or not.
Mm.
Well, what do you mean when you say correct? Like, I guess I should say it has survived such a long period of history, the concept of random jury duty, that people seem really convinced about the objectivity of, rather than having a judge decide the fate of someone, it's the importance of having their peers decide their fate.
Well, I have to say, based on my one experience, and I was rejected, by the way, I just felt very nervous. I hoped I never had to go before a jury myself. In some cases, expertise is required. And as I said, we never, we don't have the truth, I guess I'll call it. That's a dangerous word, but was that person really guilty or not guilty, as whatever the jury decided?
Yeah.
So I don't think we can say that it may be proven acceptable, but I don't know that we can say it's proven effective or correct.
There's another one of those very hard questions. The Democracy Lab is made up of experts in their fields and also community members. How to negotiate that balance? Experts themselves aren't always right either. So the assumption is that if we populate key positions with experts only, we would like them to arrive at good decisions, and they often do. But one wonders about that sometimes. Technological, maybe one trend that we've seen over the past couple of decades is the idea that technological advancement and technological expertise can help us to solve what are fundamentally political or cultural problems. And that is something about which I have my doubts. Technology is a glittering lure sometimes, but any technological tool is also going to have the ethical disposition of whoever wields it. So hiding behind technology or behind expertise without some critical assessment of what both those things are, yeah. So open questions. I saw Joan's hand up, but Hollis and Matthew, if you want to continue, absolutely. But I saw Joan's hand up too.
I defer to Joan for sure.
And Nancy, thank you for your comment in the chat. Selective service, absolutely. I forget which of the bills it's in right now. The thing that was a few weeks ago called the John Lewis Act, I think it was in that one. And these are proposals to make selective service or some sort of like citizen service compulsory, mandatory, or widely held. And those are excellent ideas. Hi, John.
My question is, as a research institute, what primary question are you addressing now?
Indeed. So the Democracy Lab is a brand new thing. We just launched it last month, about a month ago, although we've been thinking about it for a long time. And what we're going to do, we're going to maybe, I hate to say it in this way, but take advantage, oh gosh, that's a kind of callous way to say it, but take advantage of what we are all forced into by the pandemic to spend a year thinking about what we want it to be, what we want its design to be, what we want its curriculum to be, what does participation look like? Yeah, but the big overarching question, what could democracy be? What could it look like? How would we practice it? If you have an answer to that question, I would be happy to hear and happy to help you guide us to figure that out, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, big questions, big questions. Sid, haven't we all thought, and I see Jeff, I think Sid's question came into the chat. Haven't we all thought of some sort of service to the country where the military or other would benefit the nation? Indeed, yes. You know, this is maybe now Scott Henkel just talking as like John Q. Citizen, not Democracy Lab director or whatever, but you know, institutionalized, weaponized, politicized selfishness has been the rule of the last half century or so. And I just think there's no getting around that. And also, I think that the ideals of public service are strong. They're powerful tools to the notion of public service. And that sort of altruism, that sort of care for one another has generally been laughed at in the past few decades. But I think those wielding the tools of the ideals of the wisdom of public service, I think those are powerful things worth defending. So yeah, absolutely. And then Nancy and Jeff.
So just one comment and then kind of a question. I think we'd be better off as a country if people voted their own selfish, greedy, enlightened self-interest. I think oftentimes we vote against our self-interest. I think we'd make an advance if in fact it was an enlightened self-interest, an informed self-interest. I think communitarianism would be lovely, but I would just accept if people in tough situations would actually vote for their own sort of enlightened self-interest. But where I wanted to go was this idea of jury duty, or the idea of community service, or is flipping the narrative of the nation, right? So we're a nation based on rights. We talk lots and lots and lots about rights. We have the Bill of Rights. We have very few codified duties or obligations. Voting isn't even a duty or an obligation or a legal one in this country. It is in some countries. I think Australia fines people for not voting. But I wonder to what extent the Democracy Lab might ask questions not about, and I know rights are very important, right? The right to vote, the right to have access to information. But we spend very little time talking about the duty. And I was talking to a fellow who was voting in the Colorado election recently. And he said he had voted only in part because he hadn't had the time or the inclination, or actually in his case, the information necessary to cast an informed vote on some of the issues that were being raised. And so, he raised the point that maybe a good citizen ought not to vote if the vote is not well informed. And I see the league playing a big role in terms of informed voters. But the whole question of duty, do we always have a duty to vote? Do we actually have a duty to not vote about things for which we don't have information? And so the question, I guess, the broad question of the Democracy Lab is how seriously, how important, how central will be questions of duty rather than questions of rights. We've hammered those for centuries.
Yeah. Let me speak to the first point first. Another one of the hats that I wear, I just finished a 3-year term as president of the Working Class Studies Association, an academic organization, international, interdisciplinary, geared to promoting questions of work and the quality of work, etc. And one very common thing that we often hear is maybe not exactly as you just said it, Jeff, but a version of, if people just recognize what their interests were, they would act in way X instead of way Y. And it's a very common comment waged against working class people, working class voters, that their economic interests should dictate their choices to a far greater degree than their cultural interests, than their familiar interests, than their political interests. And it turns out, I need not explain this to you, or frankly, any of you, but people define their interest in many and diverse ways, and not often economically rises to the top for many of those people. So anyway, I mean, it's just an interesting conversation to have, right? When one group of people tries to activate a certain part of a population's values, interests, choices, we should always recognize that there is a complex dynamic to all of that. And sometimes other people's interests, they resist the way that we would have other people think. Anyway, to the first. On the question of duty, absolutely. This is, Daniel Allen talked about this to a little bit, the idea that rights come with obligations for many and complex reasons. In American political discourse, people talk about rights almost exclusively. Like, I mean, I don't have a quantitative analysis at my hand, but I think if you were to do a survey of, I don't know, choose your newspapers of whatever affiliation or whatever perspective, you would be able to find a conversation about rights outnumbering a conversation about duties or responsibilities. I don't know, 10 million to 1 would be my guess, right? It's just a conversation where the center of gravity in the United States political discourse is so thoroughly on the question of rights and so thoroughly away from the question of duties that things are just simply out of whack. And it raises the level of people being able to say all sorts of crazy things in the name of rights and allowing them to ignore all sorts of very reasonable things in the name of duties, obligations to one another. There's many ways to think about basic ethical questions. One of them is, what do we owe to one another? Those things might be called duties. Those things might be called civic duties. And I think if the Democracy Lab were to ask that question loudly and repeatedly, I would be very interested to see what answers we get. I see Matthew's hand, and I'm happy to have a conversation. Also, if there are others who have questions that you might want to ask before we go to a second question from Matthew, of course, I'm happy to have it, of course.
Okay, hearing none. So I'm wondering, is this Democracy Lab group at UW, is it primarily going to be just a group for collecting and organizing data, information, facts for other people to use? Or could we expect you to, at some point, come out and advocate for some sort of thing to enhance democracy? For example, reducing the insane signature requirements to get ballot initiatives through in Wyoming, or maybe an alternative voting method to promote better elections, things like that. Could we expect you to advocate for something at some point?
Yeah. Let's define advocacy precisely in the way that the League of Women Voters defines advocacy. We are a mix at the moment. We are a mix of faculty and students and community members, and we don't agree with one another all the way down the line, and I'm glad that's the case. I like a big, vigorous debate. I also like the ideals of public service. So if we define advocacy precisely in the way that the League does, then that answer is yes. Sometimes people confuse advocacy with acting in a partisan way. And of course, we're a public entity, so we would stay away from those kind of things. The power of an idea, Matthew. Sometimes I'm a little, I hear when people say, sometimes academics have their heads in the clouds and they need to have their feet on the ground to a greater degree. I hear that, absolutely. The way I approach that question is what I said in the presentation. Ideas don't defend themselves. It's important to come up with good ideas. It's important to have ideas. It's important to have a robust research presence and agenda. But ideas don't defend themselves. They need human beings to advocate for them, to promote them, to get them into public discourse. If one of the things that the Democracy Lab can do is to get good ideas into public discourse, then I think that will be, in part, a win. Here's one that I was noodling on. I was going to include this as part of the presentation, but didn't. There is a belief out there, generally speaking, that when turnout in elections is high, Democrats win, and when turnout in elections is low, Republicans win. That's a widely held idea, and sometimes widely held ideas have a basis in truth, but are they all the way true, all the way across the board? No, 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 no. Last week's election for governor of Virginia had high turnout and a Republican won. The election that I was the campaign that I was part of for Senate District 6 had high turnout and a Republican won. There is a book called The Turnout Myth. And one of the things that, a couple of you here know me a little better than others, and my memory is no good. I can generally remember the title of a book or an author, but generally not all of them at the same time. So I'm going to finish answering this, and maybe Matthew, go ahead and talk for a little bit. But anyway, there's a book called The Turnout Myth that is, if memory serves, like a 30 or 40-year study on level of turnout and outcome of election. And what the authors find is that it's a mix. Sometimes when people turn out a lot, Republicans win. Sometimes when people turn out a lot, Democrats win. So the complication of that I think deserves further thought is, if the Democratic Party thinks they're going to win more often than not if turnout is high, of course they're going to advocate policies that help to make the turnout high. If the Republican Party believes that they're going to win more often when turnout is low, of course they're going to advocate for policies that reduce the turnout. That's not a partisan comment. That seems to me basic logic. But anyway, if the empirical truth is, when turnout is high, it's a mix. It's not always predictive about who wins. Then I think that's a good argument for entities like the Democracy Lab and the League of Women Voters to say as loud and as frequently as possible, hey, when turnout's high, not going to be able to predict who wins. Therefore, let's increase access as greatly as possible. Okay, I need to cite my source. So somebody talk for a minute. And I'm going to do a quick Google search and I'm going to find this book.
I have a question, but I'm going to wait for you to come back.
Okay.
Why do you think democracy did slip away in Greece? Is it just the evolution of political systems that they go through these iterations?
Powerful
Does
person.
anybody know?
So my take on that is Greece. Greece joined the European Union, which was ostensibly about I don't know, had a lot of ideas behind it, but in the most concrete terms, it was a way of holding some economies hostage to a banking cartel in France and Brussels and parts of Germany. And so they imposed this unbelievable austerity regime on Greece in, I think it was 2017, maybe.
Right.
And Greece was then, and I think still is, experiencing Great Depression level economy right now because of that regime. And what happened was the Greeks, they voted in a party called, well, I forget the name, but they voted in this guy called Alexis Tsipras, and he campaigned on saying that they were not going to honor that austerity regime, that they were not going to pay off those debts incurred to the central banks of Europe. And then he got in power, he got elected, and he did a complete 180 degrees, and he did exactly that. And so that's maybe partly can explain why Greeks are so dissatisfied with their system at the moment.
It just makes me wonder if there's an evolution in almost every democracy in every country, that it goes through these iterations of slipping away and then coming back. And I don't know. It's just that's just a supposition. I don't have any evidence.
It's one worth studying. Not as predictable a cycle as many, might think, but indeed. Absolutely. The book is The Turnout Myth. Voting rates and partisan outcomes in American national elections, Darren Shaw and John Petrosic, Oxford University Press, and there is me citing my source in the chat, should you wish. And there are several things I just noted that are in the chat, in addition to Nancy's hand, which I see up as well.
So I think Matthew touched on something really important, and that is our sense of that democracy is serving us or representing us. The other aspect that I wonder about in terms of the democracy lab is what for me is a very central question, and that's the impact of Citizens United on the democratic process, or what passes as a democratic process in the United States, which in fact seems to be more and more a corporatocracy rather than a democracy. And as long as Citizens United stands, as long as corporations, I mean, the shorthand is too simple, but as long as corporations are legally persons and money is speech, I don't see how democracy is going to pull itself out of its current situation. So I guess I'm wondering to what extent the Democracy Lab will take on the question of whether what we have is even seriously resembling a democracy, and the extent to which what we have, at least for many people, is something that doesn't seem like a democracy, and hence your involvement in voting in a system that is largely in service to the top, the top 1%, just seems like a waste of time, a waste of energy. I study these issues, I learn about the issues, but in fact, to rise, even to be nominated from one of these offices requires so much money that, going back to Matthew, so much money that it's not, it's not even anything that resembles a representative democracy anymore. So how about that Citizens United and its effect on whether in fact we have a democracy, or whether we perceive ourselves as having some other system entirely?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and a vital one. Citizens United is our century's version of the Dred Scott decision. Yeah, it really is. And also, that's not just an analogy. The legal basis for corporate citizenship came from the Supreme Court's Santa Clara decision, which was, I forget the year. It was Reconstruction era sometime, but it was a 14th Amendment case. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution, of course, establishes citizenships. And the intent of the 14th Amendment, when passed, was to enfranchise Black Americans, not to enfranchise corporations. The Santa Clara decision enabled corporate personhood, not, by the way, you probably know this history, not in its written decision, but in the oral argument before the decision. One of the justices, I forget the name. Again, my memory is no good. I think in abstractions, and I always want to tell people, look things up so we get the details right. But in the oral arguments to the Santa Clara decision, one of the justices stopped the lawyer. It was a railroad company lawyer who said something along the lines of, we want to make the argument that corporations are citizens in order to do blah, 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 blah. And one of the justices said, stop right there. If that's what you want to argue, all of us already agree. So argue something else. And that is the legal basis for corporate personhood in the United States. It is an incredibly flimsy decision. Now, does it have the force of law? And is the force of law flimsy? Absolutely not. So anyway, I make the parallel to Dred Scott not only because corporate personhood and 14th Amendment and enslavement, but because Dred Scott was the Supreme Court decision that people talked about after its judgment came out in the same way that people talk about Citizens United right now. I would imagine that at least a superficial understanding of what Citizens United is on the lips of many Americans to a far greater degree than most other Supreme Court decisions are. It's a thing that people talk about it. You ask about it right here. And what my hope would be is that Citizens United continues to motivate us in the way that Dred Scott motivated the abolitionists of the 19th century. It was a thing that pissed them off royally. It became a thing that they organized around. It became a thing that agitated their political involvement, just like I would want to see Citizens United, with all of its injustice, motivate our political involvement now for all the reasons you talk about. Is the United States more corporatocracy than a democracy? You tell me.
Yes.
Yeah, there's Priscilla. Hi, Priscilla.
Hi.
Yeah.
I forgot to turn this off.
Amazing. So therefore you're yes. How you doing?
Well, I'm just trying to take all this in. It's too much. Too much. I have
It's
to
a
think
lot.
about it.
I see Hollis's hand too. And then Katie and Sid, we talked about me spending a half an hour on screen, and you all have things that you need to do. I am delighted to continue the conversation. It's a good one, but also guide us, please, on that question. Go ahead, Hollis.
Yeah, one thing I'm curious about living in Wyoming, and when I heard this was a democracy lab at UW, I thought it might focus on Wyoming issues. You talked early on about toxic conversation, discouraging people from participating. Another thing that I think, and this is not, a horrible, evil thing, but we are overwhelmingly Republican or one-sided in this state, and that discourages the minority from participating. And I'd be curious to know if there might be some way to encourage people. You're never going to win a presidential election, but there are other ways the minority may effectively participate. Have you discussed that topic at all?
Yeah. How to say it? Wyoming's politics fascinate me for lots of reasons, and maybe this is all a matter of public record. Of course, I'm not going to say whatever, but you probably all know my friend Joanne True of Casper, who was in the news very much during the last election campaign. And one of the reasons that she was in the news as a loud and proud and out Republican was a big supporter of the Wallace for Wyoming campaign. So, if one looks superficially, one sees numbers like the overwhelming balloting for Republicans in Wyoming. But there are also these surprising other things where there are alliances between what might be called the moderate wing of the Republican Party and people who have been Democrats for years and years and years. The Simpson family is another good example. Like the first
Liz Cheney is headed that way, maybe. I know that there are exceptions, but it is really overwhelming at times.
Oh, that's right. That's absolutely true. That's absolutely correct. Yeah.
Okay, I think if it's okay with everybody. Jamie, did you have a question before?
No, I was just clapping. It was a great discussion. Thank you.
We kept you here about an hour and it's been fascinating. So I want to thank you for coming, Scott. And we're going to post this recording of this presentation and discussion on our League of Women Voters YouTube page so that everybody in the Laramie and State League can access it. I think they'd find it fascinating and interesting. I have one last question before we end. What's the best way to follow what you guys are doing at the Democracy Lab or keep up to date with any programs or plans or public meetings, that type of thing?
Excellent. Thank you for that question. And thank you once again. I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation. It was a great conversation. I'm really happy we had it. So thank you and good luck to you and the rest of the auction and whatnot. But what I'm going to do, the Democracy Lab is a project of the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research. And on the Humanities Institute's webpage, there's a nice big bold button right there that says, gosh, if my memory were better, it says something along the lines of connect with us, stay connected, right? If you go to please and thank you, this website, this is the Humanities Institute's website. And right up there at the top, there's a button that says stay connected. It'll just ask you for your name and your email, and that will get you on our email distribution list. And that is the best and easiest way to follow along with what we do. We're also on Facebook and YouTube, which you can also find our past events and announcements and other things there. But the best way is to sign up for our email list. So please and thank you. I hope you all do.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you all for your work. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your questions and the conversation.
And you're welcome to participate in our silent auction too.
Thank you. Thank you. What I would like to do, rather than getting a thing out of an auction, what I would like to do is just to make a donation directly. And Katie ever so generously suggested that she would send me an email to a link to donate, and that would be my preference. Please and thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for your work. It was nice to meet
Bye.
you, those of you who I don't know, and I hope to all see you in person sometime very soon.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Great. Bye, everybody.